No employee dared to contradict the arrogant billionaire CEO until the new black cook silenced him. "You have no right to speak to me that way." The voice echoed through the Whitmore Corporation's executive dining room like thunder on a clear day. 200 employees simultaneously stopped chewing, forks suspended in midair, staring in disbelief at the black woman in an apron who had just yelled at the most powerful man in the company. Richard Whitmore, Jr., CEO and heir to a vast business empire, was paralyzed. His icy blue eyes, accustomed to instant submission, met the determined gaze of Kesha Washington. At 32, she had just done something none of the 2,500 employees in that glass tower had ever dared to do: confront the tyrant head-on. The silence was deafening. Executive secretaries, department managers, vice presidents, everyone witnessed the unthinkable. The new cafeteria employee, hired just 2 weeks earlier, stood before the billionaire as if she were his equal. "How dare you?" Whitmore began, his voice trembling with pure indignation. But Kesha interrupted him, something no one had done in years. "I dare, because someone has to. You may own this company, but you don't own people's dignity." Kesha's story had begun 3 months earlier when she was unfairly fired from her previous job. She was a trained chef, but the economic crisis had forced her to take whatever work she could find. The job at the Whitmore Corp cafeteria paid the bills, but it was a far cry from her culinary dreams. From her first days, she quietly observed the toxic dynamics of the company. Richard Whitmore, Jr. treated employees like disposable objects. He yelled at assistants for bringing the wrong coffee, humiliated managers in public meetings, and fired people for imaginary infractions. What bothered Kesha most was how everyone accepted it. 5,000 employees groveling before a man who had inherited everything and built nothing. She had seen this dynamic before in other jobs, but never so extreme. On that fateful day, Whitmore had stormed into the cafeteria during lunch, loudly complaining that quality was declining and that he might outsource the entire operation. His words were poison, aimed specifically at the cafeteria staff, all of whom were black or Hispanic, as he looked directly at Kesha. "People like this shouldn't be preparing food in a serious company," he said, pointing surreptitiously in her direction. That's when Kesha exploded. Now, at the epicenter of the storm she had created, she stood tall, shoulders squared. Her grandmother had always said, "Those who bow their heads to the powerful will never rise against the weak." That moment would define not only his future at the company, but hers as well. What no one knew was that Kesha Washington was not just a cook desperate for a job. She held secrets that would make this confrontation only the first act of a revolution that would shake the entire corporation. If you're enjoying this story of courage and justice, don't forget to subscribe, because what happened next completely changed the rules of the game at that company. Whitmore thought he was dealing with yet another submissive employee, but he was about to discover he had completely underestimated the woman standing before him. What happened in the minutes following Kesha's confrontation would set the tone for the coming months at Whitmore Corporation. Richard Whitmore, Jr. was not used to being contradicted, let alone publicly humiliated by an insignificant cafeteria worker. As the room remained deathly silent, Whitmore regained his composure with the calculated coldness of someone who had learned to turn embarrassment into power. His eyes slowly scanned each face in the room, memorizing the witnesses to his humiliation. "Interesting," he muttered, adjusting the cuffs of his Italian shirt. "Very interesting indeed." In the days that followed, Whitmore's revenge began subtly, but cruelly. Kesha arrived at work on Monday to find her schedule had been changed. She was now assigned the hardest shift, 5 a.m. to 2 p.m., preparing breakfast for executives and lunch for 1,500 employees. "Operational issues," explained Janet, the supervisor, avoiding eye contact. "Direct orders from the board. Kesha, knew it was a lie. Janet, a kind 50-year-old woman who had worked there for decades, was just another pawn in Whitmore's game. But Richard Whitmore Jr. had no idea who he was dealing with. Kesha had survived far worse than a spoiled boss. She had grown up in Detroit's most violent neighborhood, raised by a grandmother who cleaned offices at night and sold flowers on the street corner during the day. By the age of 8, she could cook dinner for 3 people with just $2 worth of ingredients. At 16, she worked part-time at a diner while studying recipes from library books. At 25, she graduated as a chef against all odds, facing teachers who doubted whether people like her had the discipline for haute cuisine. Whitmore thought he was dealing with a desperate employee. In reality, he was provoking a woman who had turned every obstacle into a stepping stone. The harassment intensified. Whitmore began appearing in the cafeteria during Kesha's shifts, circling the tables like a predator, searching for flaws. He complained that the coffee was 1 degree too hot, that trays weren't perfectly aligned, or that the food had an imperceptible excess of salt. Each complaint was directed specifically at her, in front of colleagues and customers. It seems, "Our new employee needs additional training," he would announce loudly, making sure more people heard. "Perhaps we should consider stricter standards for future hires." The racial undertones were always subtle, never explicit enough for a formal complaint, but far too obvious to ignore. Kesha saw her colleagues lower their heads, pretending not to hear, terrified of becoming the next target. The final straw came on a Thursday when Whitmore appeared in the cafeteria, accompanied by 3 visiting executives from a partner company. He asked to speak to her, the person in charge of the kitchen, in front of everyone. "This is Kesha," he introduced with a fake smile. "Our newest acquisition. Tell our guests about your previous culinary experience, Kesha." It was a trap. If she mentioned her previous jobs in snack bars and small restaurants, she would be ridiculed. If she lied or refused to answer, she risked being fired for insubordination. Kesha looked him straight in the eye. "My experience includes turning limited ingredients into nutritious meals for hardworking people who deserve dignity and respect, Mr. Whitmore. It's a skill I learned at a young age and still use today." The response was so elegant and sharp that one of the visiting executives suppressed a smile. Whitmore realized he had been outmaneuvered again. "How charming," he replied, but his voice betrayed his growing irritation. "I hope that creativity translates into measurable results." That night, Kesha returned to her small apartment and did something she hadn't done in years. She called her grandmother Dolores, now 83 and still living in Detroit. "Grandma, remember when you taught me that those who sow humiliation reap a storm?" The loving voice of the woman who had raised her traveled across the miles. "Of course, my dear. Why do you ask?" "I think it's time for some people to reap what they've sown." Kesha wasn't just a talented cook. She had spent 3 years working as an assistant to a renowned investigative chef who specialized in exposing restaurants that violated health and labor standards. She knew exactly how to document irregularities in an irrefutable way. And Whitmore Corp, she was discovering, was riddled with them. While Whitmore planned his next public humiliation, Kesha began preparing something that would turn her small act of defiance into a storm that could wipe out much more than just an arrogant CEO. What no one in that cafeteria could have imagined was that the woman they had seen confront a billionaire wasn't just defending her dignity, she was gathering information for a war Whitmore would never see coming. Kesha's investigation began meticulously the following morning. She arrived at 4:30 a.m., an hour before her official shift. With free access to the empty corridors of the corporation, she began her work. What she discovered in just the first few days left her appalled. The cafeteria kitchen was violating at least 15 basic health regulations, equipment with unreported gas leaks, freezers operating at unsafe temperatures, expired ingredients relabeled and reused. Even worse, the cleaning staff, mostly immigrants, worked without adequate protective equipment while handling highly toxic chemicals. Kesha discreetly photographed everything, every irregularity, every document, every defective piece of equipment. Her experience with the investigative chef had taught her exactly which agencies to contact and how to build an irrefutable case. Meanwhile, Whitmore intensified his campaign of humiliation. In the second week of his persecution, he brought a group of Japanese investors to tour the company's operations. He made a point of passing through the cafeteria during peak hours. "This is our culinary team," he announced loudly, gesturing toward Kesha. "We are always experimenting with different approaches to cost reduction." The subliminal message was clear. Black and Hispanic employees were cheap experimentation compared to previous standards. The investors exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly embarrassed. Kesha held her head high, continuing to serve with impeccable professionalism. But that night she added even more photographs to her growing file. Her true ally appeared unexpectedly. Patricia Coleman, the company's internal auditor, had noticed strange movements in the cafeteria's financial reports. A 48-year-old black woman with a degree in accounting from Harvard, Patricia held one of the few leadership positions in the company that had been earned through pure competence. "Kesha," she whispered during a break in the hallway, "we need to talk." They met at a small cafe 6 blocks from the company. Patricia revealed devastating information. Whitmore was overcharging the cafeteria, declaring fictitious expenses and pocketing the difference. Worse still, he had been doing this for 3 years. "I found out by accident while auditing supplier contracts," Patricia explained, sliding a discreet folder across the table. 40% of the reported expenses are fictitious. We're talking about fraud in the millions of dollars. Kesha opened the folder. Detailed spreadsheets showed alarming discrepancies between products purchased and reported values. Premium, equipment listed at inflated prices, special organic ingredients that were actually conventional products with falsified invoices. "Why are you showing me this?" Kesha asked. "Because you were the first person in years to stand up to that man," Patricia replied, her eyes shining with admiration. "And because I know you have a background in food auditing. I saw your resume when you were hired." Patricia didn't know Kesha's full plan, but she was providing exactly the weapons Kesha needed. Corporate fraud was a federal crime, far more serious than health violations. In the days that followed, Whitmore made his most serious mistake. During a director's meeting, deliberately held in the cafeteria to maximize her humiliation, he made explicitly racist comments about the limited intellectual capacity of employees from certain backgrounds to handle sophisticated corporate standards. What he didn't know was that Kesha had hidden her cell phone behind the napkin. Dispenser recording every word, 25 minutes of incriminating content, including laughter and agreement from other executives. That night, Kesha meticulously organized her evidence. She had photographs of the health violations, documents of financial fraud provided by Patricia, a recording of the racist comments, and a detailed list of witnesses willing to testify. But she needed something more, something that would make Whitmore's downfall not just legal, but publicly devastating. The answer came when she discovered that he was running for the National Business Association's Ethical CEO of the Year award. The ceremony would be broadcast live with national press coverage. Kesha smiled for the first time in weeks. This wouldn't just be about justice. It would be about perfect timing. The following Friday, Whitmore showed up in the cafeteria accompanied by a film crew. He was producing a promotional video on inclusive leadership for his award nomination. He specifically asked to film natural interactions with our diverse operational team. When he approached Kesha with his fake politician's smile, she replied with poisonous sweetness. "Of course, Mr. Whitmore. It will be a pleasure to show how things really work here." What he interpreted as submission was actually the deadly calm of someone who knew exactly when the hammer would fall. Kesha had timed her move for the following Tuesday during the live award ceremony. Whitmore thought he was filming his victory. In fact, he was documenting the last 48 hours of his career. The Ethical CEO of the Year award ceremony was being broadcast live across the country. In the elegant ballroom of the Metropolitan Hotel, 500 executives, journalists, and political figures awaited the presentation of the most prestigious award in American business. Richard Whitmore, Jr., impeccably dressed in a designer tuxedo, chatted animatedly with reporters in the front row. His confidence was absolute. He had discreetly bribed 2 members of the judging committee and manipulated financial figures to appear the perfect candidate. "Our company represents the future of inclusive management," he declared to the cameras, his politician's smile rehearsed. "We believe that diversity is not only morally right, but strategically smart." 5 blocks away, Kesha Washington was putting the finishing touches on her plan. She was not at the event, but she had sent something much more powerful than her physical presence: the truth. 3 hours before the ceremony, Patricia Coleman had personally delivered a folder containing devastating evidence to the president of the National Business Association, photographs of health violations, documents of accounting fraud, and a 25-minute recording of Whitmore's explicit racist comments. "We believe the public deserves to know the real candidate," Patricia said coldly as she handed over the material. The association's president, James Morrison, was a man of integrity who had built his reputation on advocating for corporate transparency. As he reviewed the evidence, his face grew progressively paler. "My God," he murmured, staring at the photographs of spoiled food being reused. "This is criminal." The audio recording was the final blow. Whitmore's unmistakable voice echoed through the office. "People like this should not be preparing food in a serious company. Certain backgrounds, limited intellectual capacity." Morrison immediately called an emergency committee meeting. The decision was unanimous. Whitmore would be publicly exposed during the live broadcast. Back in the ballroom, the ceremony proceeded as normal. Whitmore had been called to the stage and was speaking about family values and social responsibility when Morrison discreetly walked up the side carrying a tablet and a wireless microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison interrupted, his voice echoing through the speakers. "Before we proceed with the awards, we have received information that I feel is essential to share with all of you." Whitmore froze mid-sentence. Something in Morrison's tone alerted him to the impending danger. The cameras automatically focused on the association president. "We have just received documented evidence that one of the award nominees is involved in corporate fraud, serious health code violations, and systematic racial discrimination." A murmur rippled through the audience. Whitmore tried to maintain his smile, but sweat began to form on his forehead. Morrison connected the tablet to the sound system. "With the viewer's permission, we consider it essential that you hear these legally obtained recordings." Whitmore's voice filled the hall, amplified by professional speakers. Every racist word, every degrading comment, every knowing laugh from his executives echoed through the 500 guests in absolute silence. People like that shouldn't be preparing food. Certain backgrounds, limited intellectual capacity. The cameras captured every second of the humiliation. Whitmore's face gradually shifted from the pink of shame to the white of pure terror. He tried to approach the microphone to explain himself, but Morrison stopped him with a firm gesture. "The photographs you are about to see were taken in the Whitmore Corp kitchen a week ago. On the giant screen behind the stage, shocking images appeared one after another. Expired ingredients with falsified labels, equipment with dangerous leaks, employees without protective equipment handling toxic chemicals. And here," Morrison continued, "we have the financial documents proving systematic fraud. $3 million in fictitious supply contracts for the corporate cafeteria." Whitmore tried to flee the stage, but Morrison remained relentless. "Richard Whitmore, Jr., you are hereby disqualified from this award. Furthermore, this evidence will be forwarded immediately to the federal prosecutor's office for criminal investigation." The hall erupted. Camera flashes exploded like fireworks. Reporters shouted questions. Executives who, moments earlier, had been shaking Whitmore's hand, now moved away as though he carried a contagious disease. Whitmore tried one last desperate gambit, grabbing the microphone with trembling hands. "This is a conspiracy, a setup. I built my company from scratch, created jobs, contributed to the economy." Morrison interrupted him coldly. "Mr. Whitmore, your company was built on disguised slave labor and documented fraud. The only jobs you've truly created are for the lawyers who will now have to defend you." As security guards escorted him out of the hall, Whitmore shouted desperately, "Who did this to me? Who provided these lies?" Morrison smiled for the first time that night. "A courageous employee you tried to humiliate, Mr. Whitmore. Someone who proved that integrity has no color, no social class, and no price." 3 kilometers away, Kesha watched the live broadcast in the small apartment she shared with 2 colleagues. When she saw Whitmore being escorted away in utter humiliation, she did not feel sadistic pleasure. She felt justice. Her phone rang. It was Patricia. "Kesha, you need to see the news. All the major networks are covering the story, and there's more. The board of directors wants to meet with you tomorrow." What no one expected was that Whitmore's downfall would be just the first domino in a series of events that would transform not only a company, but an entire industry. The woman he tried to break was about to become the most powerful force the corporate world had ever known. The board meeting the next morning was historic. 12 members of Whitmore Corp's senior management gathered for an emergency session to discuss the wreckage left by the live broadcast, which had already gone viral on social media with over 5 million views in just 18 hours. Kesha entered the executive meeting room for the first time in her life. The same environment where employees had once been humiliated and fired on Whitmore's whims now welcomed her as a hero. Margaret Thompson, chair of the board and the only woman among the directors, led the conversation. "Miss Washington, first we want to formally apologize for the toxic environment we allowed to thrive under our supervision," Thompson said, her voice heavy with genuine embarrassment. "Second, we want to offer you the position of Director of Culinary Operations for the entire corporation with a salary of $250,000 a year." The offer was 10 times her previous salary, but Kesha had bigger plans. "I accept the position, but with conditions," she replied, placing a folder on the mahogany table. "First, immediate implementation of an anti-discrimination training program for all executives. Second, creation of a permanent employee committee to report irregularities without retaliation. Third, preferential hiring of professionals from marginalized communities for leadership positions." Thompson smiled for the first time. Approved. All approved. Meanwhile, Richard Whitmore Jr. faced the perfect storm his arrogance had created. On the Monday following the broadcast, the federal prosecutor's office filed 17 criminal charges against him: corporate fraud, tax evasion, labor violations, and systematic racial discrimination. His lawyers estimated that he would face between 15 and 20 years in federal prison. Worse still, his reputation was completely destroyed. Videos of his public humiliation went viral, with compilations of his facial expressions during the exposure racking up millions of views. The fall was even more brutal financially. Shareholders filed a class action lawsuit demanding compensation for losses caused by mismanagement. Partner companies terminated multi-million-dollar contracts. Whitmore Corp's stock value plummeted 72% in 1 week. Whitmore was forced to sell his $20 million mansion, his classic car collection, and even his yacht to pay for lawyers and settlements. A man who once humiliated employees for inadequate standards now lived in a modest apartment, drove a used sedan, and faced looks of recognition and contempt wherever he went. The transformation at the company was revolutionary. With Kesha leading the changes, the cafeteria became a national model of excellence. She implemented a culinary training program for employees, offered scholarships for culinary courses, and created a promotion system based exclusively on merit. Patricia Coleman was promoted to CFO, becoming the first black woman to hold an executive position in the company's history. Janet, the supervisor who had always treated Kesha with respect, was appointed general manager of operations. Dozens of employees who had previously lived in fear now held leadership positions in their departments. 6 months later, Business Weekly magazine published a cover story on the Whitmore Revolution, highlighting how a company on the brink of ethical collapse had become a benchmark for diversity and inclusion under new leadership. The change began when one courageous employee decided that dignity was non-negotiable, wrote the lead journalist. Kesha Washington proved that one person willing to fight could transform not only her own life, but an entire corporate culture. Public recognition came when Kesha was invited to speak at the National Congress on Workplace Discrimination. Her speech, watched by more than 10 million people, went viral with the phrase, "We don't have to accept disrespect to keep our jobs. We need to create jobs that respect who we are." Universities began inviting her to teach courses on ethical leadership. Companies across the country requested her consulting services to transform their work environments. Kesha had become a national symbol of corporate courage. The most powerful moment came during a business conference a year after the scandal. Kesha was on the main stage when someone in the audience shouted, "What if you're wrong? What if some people really don't deserve certain opportunities?" Kesha smiled with the confidence of someone who had already proven her point beyond dispute. If it's a mistake, then how do you explain that our company's productivity increased 40% after we stopped wasting energy humiliating talented people? How do you explain that our revenue hit historic highs when we started promoting based on competence rather than family connections? The audience erupted in applause. The question had been answered not with words, but with measurable results. Year after the initial confrontation, Kesha returned to the cafeteria where it had all begun. It was now her office, decorated with certificates of recognition and photographs of employees who had been promoted under her leadership. Through the window, she could see Richard Whitmore Jr. waiting for the bus on the street. He now worked as a salesman in a small electronics store, earning in a month what he had once spent on a single meal. His billionaire friends had abandoned him when the scandals became public. His ex-wife had filed for divorce, taking half of his remaining assets. His children, ashamed of their father, had even changed their last name. Kesha felt no pity, but she also felt no hatred. What she felt was something far more powerful, the certainty that she had used her voice to protect hundreds of people who had none. Patricia entered her office with a stack of resumes. "We have 300 applications for the supervisory positions," she announced with a smile. 80% are from women and ethnic minorities. It seems your story has inspired a lot of people to try something new." "Perfect," replied Kesha, leafing through the documents. "Let's give each of these people the chance they deserve." At that moment, her phone rang. It was an invitation to dinner at the White House, where she would be honored as one of the transformative leaders of the decade. The young woman who, just 3 years earlier, had washed dishes to survive, was now receiving recognition from the highest levels of government. The most important lesson in Kesha Washington's story is not about revenge, but about transformative courage. She showed that a person willing to fight for justice can take on any system, no matter how powerful. Her story proves that dignity is priceless, that respect cannot be bought, and that sometimes the difference between oppression and freedom lies in the courage to say one word, no. Richard Whitmore thought he was dealing with just another disposable employee. He discovered too late that he had provoked a force of nature, one that would turn his arrogance into a life lesson for the entire world. He tried to destroy her, but in the end, destroyed only himself, while she built a legacy that will last for generations. Today, when young professionals face discrimination at work, many remember Kesha's story and find the courage to act. She proved that we don't have to accept injustice to survive. We can turn injustice into a revolution that benefits not only ourselves, but everyone who comes after us. Kesha's true revenge was not humiliating Whitmore publicly. It was proving that he was completely wrong about her abilities, wrong about her value as a human being. The best revenge will always be success, built on the rubble of prejudice. If this story of courage and transformation touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to remember that a courageous voice can change the whole world. Because sometimes, all it takes to bring down the system is one person willing to speak the truth, even when the whole world prefers silence. Leave a comment if you've faced a similar situation and share how you reacted. Your story might inspire someone else to find their own courage.